I welcome you back to our in-house panel, so to speak, which is called Researching Migration and Transformation: Insights from RECET, which is a very broad title and deliberately broad title because the idea was to represent a bit what we're doing. And specifically what we're doing in the research group Migration and Transformation, which is also affectionately known as the Migration Reading Group. And before we get into introducing the speakers, my colleague Lynn Nguyen, who basically founded this reading group, will tell a bit, the story of Genesis, so to speak. What this group is about. So Lynn, if you want to take the floor.
Can you all hear me okay? So basically the Migration Reading Group was created in 2020 by me and Janis, and it just stemmed out of this idea that we would like to, be able to understand each other's research, our methods, and problems that we're interested in through the lens of migration history. What is migration history? Can we speak of a separate subsection of history? Is it always interdisciplinary? How can these different disciplines talk to one another? So it was a very grassroots, organic need of that was captured in this kind of old-fashioned format of exchanging ideas and doing a very solid reading of articles and book chapters. And then later on, it evolved, transformed into a bit of public events, invitations that we extended to international scholars, but also scholars in Austria and Vienna. We also organized some panels at conferences, this festival, and most importantly, we're very, very thankful to the Dean's Office who supported us with a generous grant, and thanks to that we can invite scholars. And what I like about this Migration Reading Group is that it's truly diverse and it's very decentralized, so we read what we are interested in, and this has been very productive for many of us. We have a chapter in the handbook on transformation that is coming out next year. We've organized panels, some new research ideas came out of it, like Janis's and possibly mine. So it's been a very productive environment for us. So I'm very happy to have new PhD students today.
Yes, thanks, Lynn. I can only sort of second this positive image, let's say. This is not a promotional event here, but there is a reason why this research group was originally called a reading group, because it's really about reading, and it's really the one thing that scholars probably should do the most and probably have the least time to do. So forcing yourself at least once a month to read something and then discuss about it. And, we often end up taking whatever we read apart, of course in a kind and constructive way, but still... you always find the flaws, but that also helps you with your own research, right? And seeing the flaws perhaps in your own research. But anyhow, we don't want to talk so much about that, but we want to talk about a few topics, a few questions related to issues of migration, which we want to reflect on through the lens of our own research. And for that purpose, we have 3 of our group members, in addition to myself, here on the panel. This is not the whole group, so you have already seen other members of the group in action. So Daria Tashkinova, who moderated yesterday, and Alexander Schneidmesser the same. So they already had their time in the limelight, so to speak, and so one criterion for getting people on the stage now was actually to force those up here, or to give a chance to those to come up here who haven't been up here yet. And that is, I will start from closest to me to furthest away. I'll start with Daniel Jerke, whom some of you already met in the context of the walking tours. He's a doctoral candidate at RECET at the University of Vienna, and he works on the history of Polish refugees during the Cold War, with a focus on Austria and Canada and the migration relations between these 2 countries. Then there is Philipp the Younger, as we call him, Philipp Moritz, who is a doctoral candidate within our doc.funds study group, The Dynamics of Change and the Logics of Transformation, to which Daria also belongs, and a few other people here in the room. He works in the history of the Austrian Migration Office. Is that the correct translation for Wanderungsamt? During the interwar period. And finally, there is Milena Boahuta, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Warsaw, but also repeatedly an associated researcher at RECET. You were with us 2 years ago, and she liked it so much that she came back, mostly, of course, to discuss with our migration reading group. Milena studies migrations from Poland to the new European Union. So you could call them perhaps East-East migrations. Before we heard about South migrations. This is about East-East migrations. But you know, we were thinking before, how are we going to do this? I mean, should everybody present their topics a little bit? But we thought, you know, we're going to make it a bit different, going to mix it up a bit by really focusing on some questions that each one of you can then reflect about, and through your research. And the first question I would begin with, it's a question, well, a question or perhaps a field of discussion is about state involvement and state control in migration, which is, I mean, it's a topic that we've already dealt with during these days, but like we want to look at this through our work specifically. So state involvement in migration on the one hand, and migrant agency on the other, and how the two interact and how they shape and transform the migration regime. That's the first question I want to prompt you with. And let's just go in the order perhaps of seating. And Daniel, you want to go first?
Can you hear me? Yes, you can. Okay. All right. The relationship between state control of migration and the agency of migrants is, in my research on immigration from Poland to Austria and Canada in the 1980s, that's really a crucial part of my research. Because, that's, I think, relatively basic, but we should still say it out loud in the sense that the both react to one another constantly. It's more or less like a cycle, and that interaction is seen by me as the researcher as it's understood like a regime, like a migration regime. There are many different definitions out there of what a migration regime is, but that's my understanding that it does not exist on its own. It exists because that's the template I use to make sense of what I see in my sources. Where to start? Maybe one finding that I found really interesting with regards to my research was when it comes to state control, that it's again very obvious, but that the state is not a monolith. So for example, state institutions can sometimes have very different ideas of what migration is supposed to be, and then they can start more or less, sometimes more openly, sometimes less openly, but really fight each other over it. And for example, when it comes to the different ministries that were involved in dealing with migration here in Austria, or in the Canadian case too, that, for example, it was very noticeable that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was in both cases often the most liberal one with regards to immigration in that case, because the diplomats always feared that if migration would be too much limited, that would have a negative impact on the reputation of that country on the world stage. That's for example, the reason why Canada ratified the Geneva Refugee Convention in the late 1960s, because they hadn't done so for the previous 20 years. And then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs won out against other institutions by claiming, okay, we get isolated among other Western nations by not ratifying it, which is kind of the opposite what is currently going on the world. So yeah, the diplomats won against the more restrictive institutions like the Ministry of the Interior, or there are sometimes even different interpretation of what is supposed to be good migration within institutions. So like is in my research most prominent in the Austrian case, that for example, that the state officials that are supposed to implement the policy decided upon by the government sometimes were not so keen on implementing it because they often considered it to be too liberal. While at the same time the politicians, there was, for example, a famous case in the autumn of 1981 that the Austrian government deliberately wanted to grant asylum to as many Polish asylum seekers as possible, because that was a prerequisite that the refugees would make it more likely to be admitted to countries overseas, like the US or Canada, because they kind of demanded that in a sense. But then the officials working in the Ministry of the Interior didn't understand the reasoning behind that decision, and the ministry really had to apply pressure on their own officials to implement what they had decided upon. And I think that, it's a really fascinating finding of my research.
Hey, thank you. Philipp, your project really centers on a state institution, this Amt, das Amt. So what can you tell us from what you're not as far along, maybe for context, in the PhD as Daniel, for instance, so maybe a lot of this is also perhaps more conceptual thinking.
Yeah.
Share your thoughts with us.
Yeah, I'm happy to share my thoughts with you. I think the office, as Janis supposed my dissertation to title, is a perfect example for explaining the interrelation of state control on the one hand and migrants agency on the others, because it's about administrative practices. I would be really happy to give you an example by showing you the questionnaire, but as I haven't prepared a presentation, you'll have to imagine a questionnaire. An interwar questionnaire for passport applicants. So, I'm not dealing with migrants who realized their migration potential yet, but the ones who had to apply for a passport to be able to do so. If they did so, I have no idea, and it will be maybe possible in a case study to follow some migrants on their ways, but not in the total of my sample, which could be around 50,000 of those questionnaires. So you see quantitative approach, but in the end, the questionnaire was designed by the Austrian officials with the aim, I guess, to support the export of Austrian labor force in the interwar period, in a period that is especially characterized by protectionism. The walls of different kinds that I mentioned in the literature. So tariff walls, but also border controls, immigration restrictions, categorizations of migrants, and so on. All these measures were part of the border regime, of the migration regime established in the interwar period, and parts of it are still present today. So we can really go to the roots of today's migration regime by studying the interwar period. And I just give you an example. It is in the questionnaire. People are asked personal stuff, expectations, and so on. But also they're asked about their occupation. And as agricultural labor was on high demand in the interwar period, also in North American countries, Canada, and the United States as well. Some of the Austrians tried to sneak in by just pretending that they were trained or qualified agricultural laborers, but in fact they were not. And that is what the Canadian officials, for example, complained about, that the Austrian immigration office didn't do their job in controlling the Austrian emigration to Canada. But I would argue they did their job, because their job was in the first place to export labor. And so they were happy about migrants who took their agency to realize their migration potential. I think that's enough for the first round. Thank you.
Thank you, Philipp. Now, Milena, you are not a historian. Unlike these two gentlemen, you're a sociologist, so you don't have access to 50,000 questionnaires from the archives, but you have access to living people. So how does the relationship between migrant agents in the state look from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a bit different perspective, being a sociologist and actually being able to produce my sources, right? But also, yes, I did a qualitative research concerning this migration. Is it East-East? It's a fascinating topic, but that was not your question. I will not start. But yeah, but I think important thing here is that these were intra-EU migrations, even if it's a new EU, again, questionable category, but intra-EU migrations. So the state is really surprisingly not present in these interviews very often. So this freedom of movement is something, is one of the basic freedoms of EU. I think the next panels you will discuss, is it really still the case? Is it still the really freedom of movement in the EU? But at least in the literature on migration, especially on emigration from Poland, this accession is really like a milestone, right? So that's something that really changed the whole migratory landscape. I remember even reading that it's one of the 5 most important events in the Polish history, just after the baptism of the state, entering the EU. Yes, but it really changed, the destinations, how people migrated, and the opportunities that opened, and all the new networks, on the new ways of living your life, really changed. But I think what I would stress here is something that we are, I think, very aware already in the migration research, but somehow it's still repeating. And this is the methodological nationalism, right? So, and even, if I introduce my research, it's like, it's about migration from Poland to Czech Republic. And then, so I also repeat this. So this focus on the nation state, and kind of assuming that this is a category that the world is organized in nation states, and these are somehow homogeneous entities, also nations. And nation state as a category, I think it's quite overrepresented sometimes in the research. So for example, I can say that I study migrations from Poland to Hungary, but then if you talk to people who really did it, then you can see that there are very different ways of framing your migratory experience, right? So someone can migrate from a small town to a vibrant urban area, right? Or they can migrate from Krakow, where the air was polluted, to a Romanian village where now they adopted 5 cats and they're like living in greenery, right? Or someone could have migrated, so move from, I know, the job they hated, where they were working overtime, to a new job when they're happy and their work-life balance is completely different. Or you can escape some problems at home, right? And this has nothing to do with the state. It's just like, it could be anywhere in a way. But it's also important to recognize that this is a certain privilege. Yes. And the state is still setting the rules, right? So it is, the certain freedom is possible within the landscape that the state regulates. So that would be my response.
Thank you. I'll actually follow up directly on that, because I find it very interesting when you say, like, the state is absent from these narratives because these people enjoy freedom of movement. They don't have to engage with the state, at least in a particular way. They don't have to engage with the whole visa border crossing dimension of the state. But something that I found, for instance, in a recent research project on East Europeans in the German labor market and in German welfare bureaucracy, actually freedom of movement is absolutely crucial in gaining access to certain state resources and claiming your rights vis-a-vis the state, or the rights that you have from the state that you get and that you're essentially receiving from the state by extending this right of freedom of movement, which is a privilege, which I think you nicely dropped to sort of hint at the second question that I want to ask all of you, which is about the role of privilege in migration. So freedom of movement, you could argue, is a privilege, certainly compared to other people, but of course it's a privilege that can work in different directions, let's say. So specifically in your case of people from Poland, say, who, when they move to Germany, might still be considered somewhat underprivileged compared to West Europeans, let's say, whoever that be, but who perhaps in Romania would rather be considered privileged. But yeah, I don't want to take away your answer, but I would rather ask you, is that, like, what is the role of privilege in this setting that you're studying?
Is it me now again? Okay. Yeah, I think it's certainly a very important category, although I think it's also problematic to employ in the research, right? And because it could be, yeah, so in sociology, anthropology, so we have the categories that are emic and ethic, right? So these are, I don't know if you also use it, so this is something that emic is the one which is inside this perspective, and ethic is the one that we employ as researchers, right? So, for example, some things that we see as privilege, the people might not see as a privilege, right? So, and it's no, I don't find it that easy to kind of give justice, to the people's experiences. So, yeah, so for example, this freedom of movement, it's definitely something that you would say is a privilege. So they could easily choose to go to Germany, to, Netherlands, Belgium, all this mainstream directions. And you could say, because also I focus on the people with higher education, so they are highly educated, they were all white Poles, so there's also this aspect. But then, when we really engage in the interviews, then a person tells me that, okay, yes, I have a nice job, I have my life conditions are quite fine here. But the thing is that I'm originally from this very small town that was hit by the transformation, and anyway, I wouldn't find a job at home. So for me, I would migrate anyway, and was it Warsaw, was it Budapest, it doesn't matter because I don't have any networks in any of these places. Or there were, some queer migrants in Czech Republic who decided to migrate after 2020. I don't know if you're aware of how the previous presidential campaign was happening, all these anti-LGBT narratives, right? And then he told me, I was actually happy at home, but I've got enough, so I decided it's time to leave. So I think it's maybe obvious to employ this intersectional approach always in your research. because some things that may seem obvious, they might not be that obvious, and I think it's also about the privilege. But another thing I would stress here is the privilege is also relational, right? So as you mentioned, that maybe if these migrants, they went to Germany, it would be a very different experience, and that's also something that is very present in my research. Some people actually did have that experience, and that was one of the reasons they would decide to go to Romania, for example, right, to kind of avoid these experiences. And so what the category I use is, I think it's interesting. There is this category of peripheral whiteness, and I think especially if we talk about Eastern Europe, it's interesting. So it's emphasizing both, this distance from being racialized in this way that is quite obvious to us, I know, towards the black community, right? But at the same time, this distance from this full whiteness, as you you could say. And this is something I can really see in this research, but also relational, not only within the one like individual biography, but also towards other migrants. And this is also something I see more and more research happening on, that racialized people can also employ racialization, right? So the attitudes towards other migrants could be very different. But maybe last thought I'd share is that something that I see now sometimes, this kind of comparisons between different people, how privileged they are or how discriminated they are. I don't know, are Ukrainian refugees more privileged than, I know, Syrian refugees? And I think it's really wrong focus, right? That it should be rather reflection on the system that produces these categorizations than these comparisons. I will stop here.
Thank you. So those are some important conceptual points also. That privilege is relational, it's intersectional, it's relative to other people, to other groups. It's not something that you choose in a way, but that relates to positions you're assigned in a system. Privilege can also be precarious, I hear, Daniel. So do tell us a bit about your, since you specifically work with this term of privilege even in the title of your dissertation, maybe tell us a bit something from a historical perspective.
Yes, you're completely right. The central term of my dissertation is precarious privileges, in order to describe the situation Polish refugees found themselves in the 1980s. The basic idea behind this term is something I read from two Australian sociologists, Rosie Roberts and Shanti Robertson. I sometimes confuse their names. And in their research, they defined privileges in the context of migration as being both relational and fragile. And what does that mean in my research context of the 1980s? On the one hand, the relational means that the favored treatment Polish refugees received in Western countries only made kind of sense in relation to other groups that were excluded at the same time. And that was not, and that was constantly kind of moving, in a sense. For example, in Canada in the 80s, especially in the early 80s, there was a major debate about the question what refugees would deserve more help. Poles in Austria, who had fled from military rule, or Vietnamese refugees in Southeast Asia. That's for example one aspect where we can see that privileges make only sense in comparison to someone else. But even if we come to the conclusion, okay, in the end the Poles were more favored over the Vietnamese, although that's questionable, but we will leave it with that. even that doesn't, we have to go even further because the Canadians were highly selective in their admission policy towards refugees, all refugees, and that included Poles. And just being read as white, which of course was highly important in Canadian society in the 80s, although it was never said out loud, that privilege of being seen as white, that was not enough. So if you were a Polish communist, anti-communist, that was not enough of being admitted to Canada. You had to prove that you would succeed in establishing yourself in Canada economically. So you, if you were not so well educated, then okay, you're white and anti-communist, but that's not enough for us. Refugees with handicaps were also often refused with the argument, that's not good enough for Canada to be seen as a refugee. And now coming to the fragile, because that selection I've been talking about also points to that privileges, I mean, who decides upon who is privileged? And in my specific case, I clearly see it's mostly state institutions who make that decision. But that, of course, leads to the next question, how do these institutions come to their decision? Which is also tied with questions of migrant agency, because sometimes the migrants could influence with their behavior the decisions of government institutions. But the point I would like to make here is that, at least in the Polish case of the 1980s, that the privileges were highly fragile because their privileges could be withdrawn at any time. And that happened in the late 1980s when a lot of Western institutions decided, okay, now it has been enough. The times have changed, and they don't deserve it anymore in comparison to other groups. And that kind of surprised a lot of Polish refugees who had been kind of get used to that treatment and couldn't understand now why the Western governments had changed their mind. Yeah, that's all I've got to say.
Okay, thank you. So you could say this privilege, the privileges you're talking about, have a lot to do with power. Power giveth and power taketh away certain privileges. And it's also intersectional, as you pointed out, essentially, along lines of ability, of class, of whiteness, but which, as you said, is not enough. It's mitigated by certain other factors. Philipp, how about privilege in the interwar period? Is it something that you can tell from your sources so far? I mean, is it something that is it a useful concept even for you?
Yeah, I don't know yet if it's a useful concept, but I can say so far it's a good question to reflect on, and I would maybe start with my privileged position as a researcher. I have plenty of sources. I have also resources at the university to follow my research for some years, and this is quite privileged, I would say. But it is also, even if I would say I'm full white, I'm from the white periphery of East Germany and have a working class background, so that is natural to focus on for me. Because if you look at privilege in the interwar period, or if you take the lens I'm taking, then you can see differences in certain, migration movements. Overall, there are too many paths to follow. I have to decide for one, and I will so by saying in the previous talk there was a number that surprised me. It was like 2/3 of the worldwide migration is so-called labor migration. I would say, wow, this is a huge number, but I would also insist on telling you that the other third has also to sell its labor force at a capitalist market. And that these conditions of a capitalist market are, are the the path I want to follow. Because if you look at the interwar period and the International Labor Organization, as I do, then you will realize that the labor markets of the interwar period are fragmented, but they're also constructed, and you can kind of observe them being constructed by different actors. In the Austrian case, one of the actors is the Austrian labor movement, and especially the Social Democratic Party and its stronghold, the Chamber of Labor. The Chamber of Labor was in connection with the International Labor Organization, that's translated into German really quite often as Internationales Arbeitsamt, so international unemployment office. And that was actually not what they were meant to be, but they were, one of their main goals was fighting for social equality worldwide, and they were doing so by setting up social rights of many of them already established in the Austrian context, but for example not in the Brazilian context, which was one of the main destination countries for Austrian emigrants. So we had the, not paradox, but we had the situation that Austrian workers who fled the economic situation in Austria ended up in a country like Brazil, where their crucial labor rights were where they were lacking crucial labor rights, and this was a gap somehow, or this was a gap the International Labor Organization tried to close in the interwar period. And I said they came quite far, but since the big rupture of Second World War and the brand new start afterwards, many of this history is forgotten, or kind of forgotten. And to commemorate these, I would really like to use my privilege as a researcher at RECET.
Thank you. I mean, I think what you said actually points also to maybe to a flip side of this concept of privilege, which is, in a way, prior to it even, which is the struggle for rights. I mean, that's sort of maybe even the more classical perspective, if you will, but certainly not less relevant. That you actually need to that it's not just a matter of people being privileged or reflecting their privilege, but actually having to struggle for basic rights in different contexts, and sometimes even having powerful allies in the process, which is quite interesting. This is a short panel, and it's so we don't have much time for discussion, but we do want to open, I think, a little bit for questions from the audience that might have come up.